In the white-columned mansion that towered over the city, she lived years of silence and dedication. The faithful maid, with calloused hands and a watchful eye, attended to every detail of the millionaire's life, believing that, even invisible, her constancy would one day be recognized. But his heart, blinded by the glitter of the world, sought another direction. Amidst luxurious parties and rehearsed laughter, he traded discreet loyalty for a glamorous woman, draped in sparkling gowns and sweet words that hid ambition. The wounded maid learned to endure humiliation without a single cry, simply silently registering the weight of injustice. What no one knew was that fate, patient and relentless, was already setting the stage for a turnaround where every tear would be returned as poetic justice, revealing who truly mattered when all the masks fell. He believed he had made the right choice. His new partner displayed him like a trophy at dinners and events, and the spotlight applauded them as the perfect couple. Meanwhile, the maid collected dirty glasses, arranged flowers, and blew out candles, carrying in her chest the pain of being forgotten. But between poorly explained contracts, excessive spending, and exaggerated promises, small cracks began to appear in the glass castle built by the millionaire and his glamorous lover. What seemed like a triumph would turn into ruin. The maid's silence, far from being a weakness, would be his greatest strength, for karma is slow but never fails. And when the truth came out, no amount of luxury would hide the one who truly sustained the house through the stormy days. If this story touched you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what you would do in her place. The Crawford Mansion stood as a symbol of power in the heart of the United States, with its imposing white columns, glass windows sparkling in the sun, and gardens that seemed never to fade. Inside, among marble walls and silent corridors, lived the millionaire who had inherited not only a fortune, but also a thirst to impress the world. And behind the scenes of this scene, there was a figure who always went unnoticed, the young maid, who dedicated every waking hour to caring for the house and the man who lived within. It wasn't just a matter of work. In every folded tablecloth, every meal served, every perfectly arranged flower arrangement, there was more than duty. There was silent love, a devotion that dared not reveal itself in words. She secretly believed that time would show the millionaire who was truly by his side. For years, her presence was the invisible foundation of everything. When he arrived exhausted from travel, hot coffee awaited him in the kitchen. When important meetings demanded perfection, she was the one who set the table impeccably, anticipating even the details no one asked of her. But for the millionaire, these gestures were part of the routine, as if the house breathed on its own. He never realized that behind every detail was a heart beating, hoping to be noticed, not as part of the furniture but as a woman. Fate, however, had other plans. It was at one of the most anticipated dinners of the year that the change began. The millionaire entered the room arm in arm with a glamorous woman, draped in shimmering dresses and intense perfumes, whose smile drew eyes like beacons on a dark night. She wasn't from the house. She didn't know his roots, but she brought with her the radiance the millionaire so desperately sought to show the world. The guests applauded, the photographers rushed to capture the scene, and the maid, discreetly in the background, felt her heart sink. It wasn't just the arrival of a new woman in his life, it was the cruel confirmation that his dedication had never been enough to break through the barrier of the uniform. From that day on, everything changed. The glamorous woman began to frequent the mansion as if she already owned it, offering opinions on furniture, demanding changes, complaining about menus. The millionaire, bewitched by her brilliance, accepted every whim as if they were signs of greatness. Meanwhile, the maid continued her routine, swallowing back tears, learning to smile to disguise the pain. Each new humiliation was kept silent, each sleepless night written only on the invisible pages of her soul. But within her, something was beginning to change. The silence wasn't just pain, it was also resistance, and fate, which watches the hearts of men, was already preparing the stage for all that injustice to be repaid. Forgotten and faithful love would soon become the true measure of true worth when the surface shine faded. The days following the grand dinner seemed to herald a new era at Crawford Mansion. The glamorous woman began to frequent the house as if she had always belonged there. Her loud laughter echoed through the hallways, her demands became orders disguised as suggestions, and every corner of the mansion began to bear the mark of her vanity. The simple flowers the maid placed in vases were replaced by extravagant arrangements. The traditional dishes she prepared with such care were swapped for sophisticated recipes dictated by glossy magazines, and even the position of the curtains was altered to let the light in more elegantly. The millionaire, enchanted, accepted everything without question, as if her every whim were a sign of greatness. For the maid, the once silent and bearable routine became a burden. It was no longer enough to keep the mansion spotless. Now she had to deal with constant criticism. "This doesn't fit with the house's new image," the glamorous woman would say, pointing to the carefully ironed linen tablecloth. "You should update yourself," she would murmur, as she spotted a fresh arrangement of roses she had picked from the garden. With each comment, the young woman's heart broke a little more, but her lips curved into a polite smile, for her dignity had always been in silence. The millionaire, blinded by the glitter, seemed incapable of perceiving the pain unfolding before him. Instead, he paraded alongside his new partner at events, responded to interviews that extolled her, and allowed the mansion to become the stage for ever more grandiose parties. The maid these days was but a shadow, moving among trays and glasses, blowing out candles as they laughed, clearing plates as camera flashes illuminated the room. But the house, as silent as the maid, began to show signs that something was wrong. Important documents disappeared from the office, invitations were sent in the millionaire's name without his knowledge, and large bills began arriving without explanation. He attributed everything to small errors, believing it was part of the adjustment process, but the maid saw and mentally noted every detail, as if collecting invisible proof that the new woman's brilliance hid more than charm. One night, as she finished tidying up the pantry after a party, the waitress found a broken glass behind the piano. The glamorous woman had laughed out loud that night, raising toasts to future investments no one knew about. The millionaire applauded, the guests smiled, but in the waitress's eyes there was something the others couldn't see, a shadow of ambition masked by glamour. She kept that moment to herself, as if sensing that life always demands hidden truths. Back in her simple room at the back of the mansion, she wrote in the notebook that had accompanied her since childhood, "He doesn't see, but fate always sees. What shines without roots cannot withstand the first storm." It was her way of keeping her faith silent, trusting that even if invisible to human eyes, her loyalty would not be ignored by the universe. The millionaire, oblivious to the weight of this transformation, continued to believe he was living the prime of his life. But karma, patient and inevitable, was already working within the walls of the mansion. The glamorous woman he had chosen was beginning to show signs of her true colors, and each humiliation the maid suffered was an invisible stumbling block that would soon bring the glass castle crashing down. The glamorous woman quickly transformed the mansion into a stage for her own vanity. Each week brought a new demand. Every corner of the house a detail altered to reflect her presence. The walls, once adorned with Crawford family paintings, were replaced with modern works hastily purchased at auctions. The greenhouses, lovingly tended by the maid, were replaced with artificial arrangements that cost a fortune, and even the piano, inherited from the millionaire's mother, was discreetly sold to make way for a designer piece that better matched the new style. The millionaire, enchanted by the novelty, accepted everything, believing these changes represented progress. The maid silently watched every memory of the house being erased. Her pain stemmed not only from unrequited love, but from the feeling of seeing the family's history being exchanged for superficial appearances. And when she tried to preserve even small gestures, a simple arrangement in the hall, a hand-embroidered tablecloth, she was corrected with irony. "That's something simple people do," the glamorous woman would say with a cold smile. The millionaire rarely intervened, and when he did, it was only to placate. "Leave it. She still doesn't understand the new phase of the house." These words, though spoken without malice, sounded like a sentence of invisibility. The relationship between the millionaire and his new partner, however, was not as solid as it appeared. At parties, attentive guests noticed that the laughter was more rehearsed than genuine, and that behind the passionate glances lay a hidden tension. On certain nights after wine-soaked dinners, arguments echoed through the hallways, muffled by locked doors. The millionaire, accustomed to making firm decisions, now found himself pressured by bold promises she made on his behalf, without consulting him. One afternoon, the family administrator found the maid in the library and, in a low voice, commented, "She signed purchase orders without permission." The young woman simply lowered her eyes, knowing she couldn't get involved. But increasingly, she noticed that the glamorous woman's glow was accompanied by dangerous shadows. It was also during this period that the humiliations intensified. At a private lunch, in front of two important guests, the glamorous woman pointed to the maid and said in a clear voice, "Look, even the way she sets the table seems outdated. We need to modernize everything, including the service." The comment caused the guests to exchange uncomfortable glances, but the millionaire, not wanting to create embarrassment, simply smiled and agreed. The maid finished serving with a broken heart, swallowing back the tears that insisted on coming. That night, alone in her room, she wrote in her notebook, "Being so. Forgotten hurts. Being humiliated in front of everyone without deserving it hurts even more, but fate never leaves injustice unanswered." Despite the spectacle of perfection displayed in public, the glamorous woman was beginning to show cracks. Her desire for control was so great that even the millionaire's closest friends were distancing themselves, uncomfortable with her arrogance. The mansion, once a symbol of warmth and tradition, had become a stage for intrigue and pretense. And, in the silence, the maid realized that all of this could not last. Karma is slow, but when it arrives, it imposes itself. While the millionaire lost himself in the false glow, the only true light remained invisible before him. The constant presence of the maid, who, despite being humiliated, maintained every detail of the house with dignity. It was only a matter of time before fate would reveal who was truly valuable when the masks fell. The following weeks brought an even more visible transformation. The glamorous woman, accustomed to dominating the mansion with her own whims, began to expand her control beyond the estate's walls. Where once she was merely a radiant companion at the millionaire's side, she now positioned herself as his representative in meetings, signing documents without authorization, and promising sums that were not in any budget. For her, luxury was merely a stage, and the millionaire, a trophy that reinforced her image. For the maid, who watched in silence, it was painful to see how his blindness deepened, handing over ever more power to the woman who lived by appearances. The first signs of wear and tear became public. During a charity dinner at a luxurious Manhattan hotel, the glamorous woman made a point of stealing the show. When the master of ceremonies invited the millionaire to give a short speech, she stepped up to the microphone and spoke in his place. The audience, surprised, heard her promise millions in donations that had not been discussed. The millionaire, taken aback, merely applauded to avoid embarrassment, but inside he felt the first trace of discomfort. The maid, who had been discreetly accompanying the support team, watched the scene with teary eyes. It wasn't just the pain of loving in silence, but the certainty that such brilliance would cost dearly. Over time, these episodes repeated themselves. At private parties, the glamorous woman would interrupt important conversations to display her superficial business knowledge, confusing investors and irritating the millionaire's former friends. At an exclusive cocktail party, she even reprimanded one of the most respected partners for failing to follow the modern dress code she herself had imposed. The awkward silence in the room was broken only by the sound of clinking glasses, but the wound was already made. At the mansion, the humiliations against the maid became even more cruel. Once, in front of guests, the glamorous woman asked her to remove a fresh flower, arrangement she had prepared from the living room. "These flowers don't suit the style of the house," he said loudly, for all to hear. The maid, teary-eyed, silently removed the vase. The millionaire, sitting nearby, pretended not to notice, preferring to avoid any friction. But the guests who were watching everything exchanged uncomfortable glances. The injustice was beginning to become apparent, even to those outside the household's routine. Still, the maid didn't let herself be completely defeated. Deep in her heart, she held the certainty that fate doesn't allow lies and arrogance to last long. In her notebook of secrets, she wrote that night, "The stage may be grand, but time always brings down those without roots. One day, everything false will fall of its own accord." The glamorous woman, however, didn't realize that her own ambition was pushing her toward the abyss. The more power he gained, the more he exaggerated. She began traveling alone on the millionaire's behalf, giving interviews in which she spoke as if she owned the fortune, and even signing invitations with the Crawford family name, even though she had no right to it. In the eyes of society, this was beginning to sound strange. In the eyes of the maid, it was merely confirmation that karma was already approaching. That same week, the millionaire discreetly received a call from a former business partner. "You trust too much in people you shouldn't," he said, sounding a warning. He laughed, trying to deflect, but the words echoed. For the first time in years, his confident smile began to falter. Meanwhile, the maid remained steadfast in her silence, gathering every piece of the story unfolding before her. She knew that sooner or later, fate would reveal who was truly worthy, and that when that moment came, it wouldn't be glittering dresses or lavish parties that would sustain the truth. Contradictions began to accumulate like dust on glass, difficult to hide, impossible to ignore. At a meeting with East Coast investors, the glamorous woman presented figures that didn't match official reports. She spoke of non-existent partnerships, promised unrealistic profits, and even mentioned the names of people who hadn't even been consulted. The embarrassed millionaire tried to soften the blow, saying they were just bold projections, but he noticed the hard stares of the businessmen who knew the seriousness of the Crawford family. When the meeting ended, the members left in silence. One of them, already at the door, commented in a low voice, "Be careful who speaks on your behalf." The phrase echoed in the millionaire's heart more than any applause he had ever received. At the mansion, the servants increasingly noticed the difference between essence and appearance. The glamorous woman walked through the corridors like an uncrowned queen, demanding invisible curtsies. She complained about the tea, the temperature of the room, the shine on the floor. But when the maid entered the scene, the atmosphere changed. Her posture was discreet but firm, her hands tireless, her eyes attentive. The gardener, who had worked there for decades, confided to other employees, "The house stands because of her. The rest is just show." These words, repeated by word of mouth, began to create a new perception. The invisible woman became, without asking, the true heart of the mansion. The glamorous woman's increasingly suspicious behavior accelerated her downfall. On a trip to California, she was seen at private dinners with rival businessmen. When questioned, she smiled and said she was merely expanding contacts for the good of the family. But documents later found revealed personal interest clauses in contracts she had drafted herself. The millionaire began to feel the weight of doubt. For the first time, he wondered if he had been mistaken from the start. The maid watched everything in silence. One day, when she entered the office to leave a tray of coffee, she found scattered papers on the desk with signatures that weren't her boss's, but bore her own name. She carefully collected them, organized them, and without saying a word, left them stacked aside. The millionaire, upon noticing, needed no explanation. Her silence was more eloquent than any accusation. It was like saying, "I see it, but I hope you see it too." And he did. The guests also began to notice. At an elegant dinner, the glamorous woman made a slip-up when discussing works of art and confused historical dates, only to be discreetly corrected by one of the collectors. Irritated, she accused the man of not understanding the contemporary value of culture. The room fell silent for a moment, and the waitress, serving water at the end of the table, noticed from the exchanged glances that her credibility was beginning to crumble. The millionaire tried to laugh to lighten the mood, but inside he felt shame burning like fire. Little by little, the comparison became inevitable. While the glamorous woman wallowed in contradictions, the maid remained steadfast, even in the face of humiliation. One afternoon, when she was reprimanded for not changing the flower arrangement on time, the guests present discreetly defended her. These flowers are perfect. Their simplicity is what brings life. The glamorous woman smiled sheepishly, but the millionaire noticed. He realized that the world was beginning to see what he himself had ignored for so long. That night, alone in his office, the millionaire reread the latest articles extolling his new partner as a symbol of modernity. For the first time, he didn't smile when he saw his photo next to hers. Instead, he closed the newspaper and fixed his gaze on the vase of fresh roses on the table. Roses the maid placed every day without fail. The contrast between the ephemeral and the eternal became clear, and deep within his soul, something was beginning to give way. The first cracks in the relationship, which had previously been mere hushed whispers, now turned into arguments clear enough to pass through walls. At first they were frictions over parties or aesthetic choices, a mismatched flower arrangement, a guest list changed without consultation. But quickly, the tension grew. The millionaire, accustomed to control, began to feel suffocated by the promises made in his name. "You can't make commitments without telling me first," he said one night, after a dinner where she had promised millions in donations. The glamorous woman laughed, correcting him dismissively. "You need to learn to trust me. Without boldness, you wouldn't be half as brilliant as you are today." The waitress, collecting glasses from the pantry, listened to every word. She didn't smile, didn't show relief, just kept the memory that finally the mask was beginning to fall away before him. The atmosphere inside the mansion changed. The glamorous woman could no longer hide her excesses. She arrived late, claiming meetings, spent fortunes on clothes and private parties, received calls that ended abruptly when the millionaire entered the room, and each time she was confronted, she responded with an attacking tone, shifting the blame. "You don't know how to position yourself. I do what you don't have the courage to do." These phrases echoed like stabs at the millionaire's authority, eroding not only the relationship, but also his image among his allies. Meanwhile, the maid became an indispensable presence. Amidst the chaos, she was the one who kept the routine intact. Coffee was always on the table, documents always organized, the house immaculate even after turbulent nights. Her constancy was like the invisible thread holding the structure together. The servants would say to each other, if it weren't for her, everything would have fallen apart. And without realizing it, even the guests began to trust her more than their glamorous companion. One morning, after a night of fighting, the millionaire came down to his office. Dejected, he found on the desk not only the newspapers critical of his social life, but also a short note left by the maid. Trust isn't imposed. It's built. There was no signature, but the small, firm handwriting was unmistakable. He held the paper for long minutes, reflecting. For the first time, he felt that the truth lay not in the gloss he chose, but in the simplicity he ignored. The crisis peaked during a reception with influential politicians. The glamorous woman, seeking applause, interrupted the millionaire mid-speech to add grandiose promises. The silence that followed was devastating. The host, flushed with embarrassment, quickly ended his speech. Backstage, an argument was inevitable. "You exposed me in front of everyone," he shouted. "I gave you a platform and you don't even know how to use it." Her response was even crueler. "You only matter because you're with me. Without me, you'd be just another rich guy." This sentence hit the millionaire like a blow. He fell. Silent, but something inside him snapped. He looked around for support and his eyes found the maid, who waited silently with a tray in her hands. There was no judgment in her gaze, only firmness and calm. In that instant, the contrast between the two women became unbearable. One screamed for attention, the other bore it all with dignity. That night, the millionaire slept in his office, unable to share a room with his partner. The maid, passing by early in the morning, left a cup of coffee on the table. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He looked up and for the first time saw more than just one employee. He saw the only person who had remained when all the spotlights went out. The tension pent up inside the mansion spilled over for the first time before outside eyes. It was at a charity dinner, the kind where every gesture is observed and every word recorded. The room gleamed under crystal chandeliers, tables impeccably set, journalists milling about searching for a Punchline. The millionaire, still reeling from recent arguments, arrived in an impeccable suit alongside the glamorous woman who strutted her stuff as if she were the sole star of the evening. Right from the start, she stepped forward and spoke, even though she wasn't on the program. Her voice was firm, but her rush to impress caused her to stumble over unrealistic promises. She spoke of non-existent projects, of investments no one had confirmed, of donations that hadn't been approved. The millionaire, forced to smile in front of the cameras, merely nodded, but shame burned deep inside him. The audience, made up of business people and politicians accustomed to well-structured speeches, exchanged suspicious glances. The spell was beginning to break. The turning point came when one of the investors stood up and asked for documents to prove what she was saying. The glamorous woman, with no way out, responded arrogantly, "You need to learn to trust. That's how the big guys play." Silence was immediate. The millionaire felt the ground disappear from under his feet. The maid, present as part of the support team, watched from afar, her eyes welling up. She wasn't just crying from the pain of seeing him humiliated, but from the certainty that fate was beginning to reveal its truth. After dinner, the crisis exploded behind the scenes. The millionaire confronted her. "You exposed me in front of everyone. You're turning me into a laughingstock." But she didn't back down. She shouted even louder, "You're only respected because you're with me. I'm your image. Without me, no one would care about you." Those words were like knives. The man who had always believed in her brilliance finally saw that, behind the luxury, there was only empty ambition. The scene didn't go unnoticed. Journalists, hotel staff, and even some guests heard the screams that escaped through the doors. The next day, the gossip columns no longer spoke of glamour, but of crisis. Headlines described her arrogance, and rumors of manipulation began to gain traction. The glass castle was beginning to crack in public. Meanwhile, the maid remained steadfast in her constancy. The next morning, she tidied the office as usual, placed fresh flowers on the table, and had coffee ready. When the millionaire entered, still exhausted from the previous night, he found the room tidy, and for the first time in weeks, felt at peace. He sat down, stared into the silence, and realized that his life had always been sustained by that invisible care. The glamorous woman, on the other hand, became more aggressive. Knowing her image was crumbling, she tried to control every aspect of the house, raising her voice even more against the employees, especially the young woman who had always remained silent. But the effect was the opposite. The more she shouted, the more everyone saw her true colors. And the more she humiliated the maid, the clearer it became who really mattered there. The millionaire, still, torn between pride and shame, began to notice the inevitable comparisons. The woman who claimed to support him was now ruining him in public, and the one who never asked for anything in return was the one who kept his dignity. It was only a matter of time before fate, ever patient, delivered its final and definitive blow. The consequences of the charity dinner were not long in coming. Reports began to circulate in trade papers, pointing out inconsistencies in the promises made by the glamorous woman. Businessmen demanded documents, charities demanded explanations, and the family council pressed the millionaire for answers. He tried to maintain control, but the more he searched, the more he realized there was no support for her statements. The glass castle built around glamour began to crumble with concrete evidence. In the mansion itself, previously ignored signs now became glaring. The administrator found contracts signed in the millionaire's name, but the signature wasn't his. Invoices with exorbitant amounts were in folders the glamorous woman had insisted on handling personally. And when questioned, she responded sarcastically, "You should thank me for taking on responsibilities you don't have time to handle." Wearily, for the first time, he didn't smile. He simply gathered up the papers and remained silent, as if realizing the weight of a mistake. The maid, amidst this chaos, maintained her firm and silent posture. While organizing the office, she found a folder, lying behind a bookshelf. Inside were drafts of letters of intent sent to business people on the millionaire's behalf, all written by her partner. Realizing the risk of exposure, she said nothing, simply placing the papers back on the desk, aligned and highlighted. When the millionaire arrived, he immediately noticed the separate stack. He needed no explanation. The maid's silence was, once again, the most eloquent proof of all. The press began to connect the dots. One columnist wrote that, "There are those who shine in the salons, but tarnish trust behind the scenes." Another recalled that the millionaire surrounded himself with people whose loyalty was questionable. The glamorous woman tried to control the damage, but each interview she gave only increased the distrust. She promised to clarify but contradicted herself. She pointed to invisible culprits, but never presented proof. Little by little, society began to see what the maid had known for a long time, that her mask would not last. In contrast, the maid's figure began to take on a new shape within the house, not because she sought prominence, but because her constancy became impossible to ignore. The gardener once remarked to the millionaire, "If it weren't for her, this house would have already been lost." He didn't respond but kept his words to himself. And one silent morning, watching the maid water the flowers in the garden, he wondered how he had never realized before that it was precisely that invisible care that sustained his life. The climax came when a recording was leaked to the press. In audio captured during a private meeting, the glamorous woman spoke about leveraging the Crawford name for personal gain. The words echoed like a sentence. The millionaire listened to the recording in his office alone. When it finished, he couldn't contain the weight crushing him. He walked to the window, looked out over the gardens, and saw the maid, as always, tending the flowers. No speeches, no stagecraft, just being true to her essence. At that moment, the contrast became unbearable. On one side, a woman who promised the world but stole trust. On the other, a young woman who never promised anything but delivered everything in silence. It was impossible to deny the truth. Fate had already shown who was truly worthy. And although the glamorous woman's final downfall was still to come, the millionaire was beginning to understand that his life would only stand if it had roots, and those roots had always been in the hands of the one he had ignored. The leaked recording was the final straw. Within days, the glamorous woman's name went from gracing the covers of fashion magazines and society columns to appearing in scandal-laden headlines. "Used influence for personal gain," the newspapers declared. "Empty promises and suspicious contracts," financial analysts pointed out. What was once synonymous with luxury and elegance now became synonymous with manipulation and unbridled ambition. The millionaire, embarrassed, was forced to speak out publicly, and his statement, though brief, carried unmistakable weight. "I trusted the wrong person, and I learned the hard way that brilliance is no substitute for the truth." As the glamorous woman's downfall spread across the news, the mood inside the mansion also changed. Staff who had previously obeyed in silence now spoke openly of relief. The maid commented, almost in a tone of relief, "Now the house can breathe again." The gardener, who had always observed in silence, murmured, "Roses never needed jewels to bloom." These short phrases echoed the same certainty. Arrogance had lost its place. The glamorous woman, feeling cornered, tried to regain her footing. She appeared unexpectedly at the mansion, dressed as if she were still the lady of the place, demanding explanations and accusing everyone of treason. But as she crossed the hall, she encountered no bows, only cold stares and the respectful distance of those who no longer recognized her as part of the story. The millionaire firmly asked her to leave. There were no shouts, no scandal, only the definitive coldness of a door closing, never to open again. Meanwhile, the maid continued her routine as if nothing had changed. She tidied the pantry, tended the flowers, and maintained the quiet order that had always been her hallmark. But this time, there was something different in the air. The millionaire began mentioning her in conversations, thanking others for her constancy, and even mentioned her name at a meeting with partners, acknowledging her as the real reason the house remains strong. The young woman, embarrassed, merely lowered her eyes, but deep down, she felt that finally her truth was being seen. Society, always quick to look for culprits and heroes, also noticed the difference. In an article published in a respected magazine, a journalist wrote, "While the world applauded the false shine, it was the quiet work of the staff, especially one dedicated employee, that kept the Crawford mansion standing through the storm. Word spread widely, and unbeknownst to her, her name became a symbol of loyalty and resilience. For the millionaire, the lesson became inescapable. Everything he had built around glamour vanished like smoke, while what seemed invisible proved essential. He began to observe the maid with new eyes, not those of a boss, nor those of someone seeking favor, but those of a man who finally recognizes the roots of his own home. That night, as he passed the greenhouse, he saw her silently watering the plants. The reflection of the golden light illuminated her tired but steady eyes. He stood still for a few moments, simply observing, and understood that there lay the answer he had sought for so long. It was not in the fleeting glow that he would find peace, but in the constant care of someone who never needed a platform to sustain everything. Karma had begun to unfold. The glamorous woman, once applauded, was now forgotten, and the maid, always invisible, was beginning to be recognized. But fate still held the final chapter, the one in which poetic justice would reveal itself in all its force, revealing who truly mattered when all the masks finally fell. The weeks following the glamorous woman's downfall were marked by silence, restructuring, and the watchful eyes of society. The millionaire knew he couldn't hide. He called a short press conference without pomp or red carpet, and for the first time he appeared without rehearsed smiles or glittering escorts. He spoke in a firm, simple voice. "I made mistakes. I trusted the wrong people, but I choose to rebuild from what is true." There were no long speeches, just this raw confession. The journalists, surprised by his sobriety, found no room for accusations. For the first time in a long time, he seemed human. This new attitude was reflected within the mansion. The lavish parties ceased, the extravagant spending was cut, and the hallways, once filled with noise, once again breathed calm. The millionaire spent more time in his own home, walking the gardens, reading in the library, and observing details he had previously overlooked. One day, upon finding his maid organizing papers in the office, he asked how she had managed to keep everything so orderly for so long. She smiled shyly and replied, "I just make sure nothing is missing." This simplicity disconcerted him more than any sophisticated phrase he had heard from the glamorous woman in years. Little by little, he began to depend more on her, not as a demanding boss, but as a man who recognizes her. He asked her opinion on small details, inquired about how to organize events more harmoniously, and accepted suggestions on how the house could be more welcoming. She didn't seek recognition, but each gesture reinforced that her invisible constancy had always been the foundation of the mansion. The family's partners noticed the change. At a board meeting, one of them commented, "The house is different, more sober, more genuine." The millionaire didn't respond, just glanced at the maid who was discreetly serving water to those present. She didn't notice the look, but everyone in the room understood there was something there beyond what met the eyes. In the outside world, the press began to change its tone. Headlines previously laden with scandal now spoke of reconstruction and lessons learned. One article quoted, "While some lose themselves in the spotlight, others find roots in silence." Without naming names, the message was clear. The millionaire was no longer seen simply as a victim of manipulation, but as someone who had learned and decided to change. The maid, for her part, remained steadfast in her simplicity. She didn't accept invitations for interviews, didn't seek to be mentioned. She continued to arrange flowers, prepare meals, and take care of the routine. But without realizing it, she had become the silent symbol of the mansion's new phase. Everyone knew that without her, nothing would have remained standing. One rainy afternoon, the millionaire entered the greenhouse and found her watering the plants, as she had always done. He was silent for a few seconds, then said, "This is where life begins again, isn't it? At the roots." She looked up in surprise and simply nodded. He smiled slightly, a different smile, not of pride, but of gratitude. It was clear that destiny was preparing something greater. The man who had traded truth for brilliance was now learning, step by step, the value of the invisible. And the woman who had been silently despised for so long was beginning, albeit unintentionally, to be the visible heart of a story of reconstruction. Fate, in its silent irony, offered the millionaire one last opportunity to face the past. A business event in New York, organized by international investors, brought together dozens of important names. The glamorous woman, still trying to maintain her poise in society, appeared unexpectedly, dressed in a daring outfit, as if she could still regain the space she had lost. The flashbulbs instinctively turned to her, but quickly shifted away. The glow that had once dominated the room now seemed out of place, almost uncomfortable. The millionaire, upon entering, didn't look away. He saw her from afar, surrounded by onlookers who whispered more than applauded. As he approached, she tried to regain her former confidence, extending her hand and forcing a smile. "You know it was all a misunderstanding, don't you? You need me." He held her hand for a second, only to release it gently, and replied quietly, "I don't need someone who destroys what I've built. I need what remains." It was the last time he spoke to her. There was no hatred in his tone, only a cold, definitive certainty. The scene played out discreetly through the event's corridors. Investors commented on his firmness, while others noted her embarrassment. An attentive journalist summed, "Say it up in a few lines the next day. The shine didn't stand the test of time, the roots won." It was the perfect summary of what had happened. In the mansion, news of the glamorous woman's appearance spread quickly. Some employees recalled with some trepidation the days of oppression she had imposed. But now the atmosphere was different. The maid, silent as ever, was tidying the library when the millionaire entered. He approached and said, "Today I realized I never need to look back." She looked up, surprised, unsure of what to say. He continued, "You were here when everything was falling apart. You were the one who kept the house alive." The maid, blushing, simply lowered her head and returned to her work. But in her heart, she felt she was finally being seen in a way she had never dreamed. At dinner that night, the millionaire spoke before all the servants. "None of us can survive without roots. This house only survived because someone cared for it with love and truth, when I myself couldn't see it." He didn't mention any names, but all eyes turned to the young woman who, embarrassed, tried to hide behind the tray. For the first time, she wasn't invisible. The glamorous woman, in turn, disappeared from the news. She remained only as an example in columns warning about the illusion of glamour without substance. Her name, once synonymous with parties and luxury, was now remembered as a lesson. The world moved on without her, and so did the millionaire. But the house, now, light and true, became a symbol of a new phase. The maid, even without seeking recognition, had become the living image of those who endure when all is lost. And the millionaire, gazing at her in silence, knew that the ultimate turning point was yet to come. One that would not only reveal his true worth, but would forever change the way he viewed love and loyalty. The return to the mansion after the New York event was unlike any other. There were no cameras waiting at the entrance, no journalists eager for statements. Just the serene silence of the estate, illuminated by the soft lights of the gardens and the smell of wet earth after a brief rain. The millionaire entered the main hall and took a deep breath, as if finally returning home after a long journey, despite having lived there for years. In the pantry, he found the maid discreetly collecting the dishes used for the staff dinner. She was surprised to see him so late, but quickly lowered her eyes and continued her task, as she always did. He remained silent for a few moments, observing every movement as if it were the first time he truly appreciated the value of what was happening there. Then he approached, took one of the dishes from her hands, and began helping her, washing and drying it beside her. The scene, simple and unexpected, was etched in her memory forever. "You don't have to do that, sir," she said in a low, almost nervous voice. He smiled slightly and replied, "I always have. I just didn't realize it before." The next day, he called a meeting of all the mansion's staff. The hall, accustomed to lavish dinners and pompous speeches, now welcomed only humble but essential people. The millionaire stood before them and spoke sincerely. "I lost so much because I mistook brilliance for value. But this house only survived because there were those who never gave up on it, even when I had already given up on myself. Today, I want everyone to know that I recognize that." He didn't mention names, but all. Eyes turned to the maid. Embarrassed, she tried to hide in the back of the room, but silent tears streamed down her face. Later, in his office, he called her over. On the desk was an old, weather-beaten notebook. "I found this among my father's things," he said, handing it to her. It was a diary where Richard Crawford, years before, had written a sentence that seemed to have stood the test of time. "Never forget to honor those who hold your roots. They are the ones who hold the tree up when the wind blows the hardest." The millionaire looked into her eyes and added, "Today I understand what he meant, and I know he was talking about someone like you." The maid couldn't hold back her tears. She tried to thank him, but he interrupted. "You don't need to say anything. You've already said everything over the years without words." They remained silent, simply sharing the feeling that, for the first time, truth had taken its place within that house. The staff began to treat her differently. She was no longer just the maid. She was the mansion's silent guardian, the invisible root that everyone now recognized. Even the family's associates commented on how the atmosphere of the house had changed since the millionaire began to value what truly mattered. That evening, as he walked through the garden, he stopped in front of the lit greenhouse. The maid was inside, watering the roses as calmly as ever. He entered, stood beside her and said, "Everything I've learned that's most valuable has come from you. From today on, I will no longer ignore that." She simply smiled, unable to respond, but in her heart, she felt that fate's justice was beginning to be fulfilled. Karma, patient, was already preparing the final act. The man who had traded truth for brilliance now learned day after day that true value was never found in luxury, but in love and quiet loyalty. And the woman who had spent her life being invisible was about to become the symbol of the final twist that would forever change the history of the Crawford mansion. Spring arrived, bathing the mansion in a brightness that seemed new, though it came from the same old window. There were no more photographers waiting at the gate, no more flashy invitations tied with satin bows. There was warm bread in the pantry, the low murmur of the staff, and a quietness that reminded one of a real home. That afternoon, the millionaire asked that the ballroom be prepared with only light tables, low flowers, and enough chairs for those who actually kept the place standing. The maid entered early, as always, gauging distances by eye, straightening the linen folds, checking microphones that rarely malfunctioned when she was around. When she finished, she noticed a detail that had not been present at any other gathering. On the main table next to the host's seat was a handwritten name card. It was hers. She felt her heart race, as if hearing her own life calling from the other side of the door. She stood, in the back, trying to hide behind the wings, until he saw her from afar and made a small gesture with his hand, the kind of gesture a family makes when they want someone close. She shook her head, backing away out of habit. He walked to her shadow and said softly, without pomp or audience, "Today you're not useful, today you stay." The phrase, so simple, moved bricks in silence. The meeting began without speeches, with people who usually stood in the background appearing for the first time in person. The millionaire spoke little, just enough to apologize where necessary and to express gratitude where he had never dared. He said the foundation would be revamped to focus first on its roots, scholarships for the team's families, training clinics for those who have always cared for others without anyone else caring for themselves, a program to preserve the house's rituals, invisible things that transform walls into shelter. When he mentioned that the curation of this program would be the responsibility of those who best understand what sustains us when no one is looking, eyes turned to the young woman. It took her a second to realize they were talking about her. She didn't applaud or cry immediately. She just took a deep breath, as if receiving her own name back. There was a final announcement as unexpected as it was silent. He placed a small, plain glass frame on the table, on which, in her small handwriting, was a phrase rescued from an anonymous note that had one morning saved a shred of her pride. "Trust is not imposed, it is built." He explained that in recent weeks he had been collecting observations she wrote in notebooks forgotten in corners, and with the team he had transformed them into guidelines. It wasn't a manual for plastering the house, it was a map to remind her of herself. The maid pressed her lips together to keep from crying out loud. The gardener wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Someone in the background murmured, "Finally, justice." When delivered in the right tone, almost seems like modesty. Outside, news that her former partner had attempted to reappear with lawyers spread through the phones like a short wind. The gate didn't open. The legal actions she thought were certain withered before the pile of documents that contradicted her, and the world which had previously offered her the spotlight now returned the same thing she had offered others: indifference. There was no staged humiliation or cruel response. There was simply repositioning. Karma doesn't throb, it adjusts, and by adjusting it frees up space for what's necessary. When the hall emptied, only a few remained, half a dozen collecting glasses, the slanted afternoon light streaming in through the window, the rich wood dust settling where before there had been only brightness. The maid walked instinctively to the garden, clutching in her pocket the small key to the greenhouse cottage she had received, like someone receiving an inheritance that doesn't weigh down the neck, but eases the shoulders. She stopped before the rosebush she had saved from the frost during the first winter in that house. There was a late bud opening out of season, a darker red than she remembered, as if the plant were returning in color the care it had received. He arrived unannounced with the gentle steps of someone who has learned the value of gentleness. He stood beside her without touching, learning the right distance between respect and desire. He wanted to say big things, promises, vows, futures, but understood that for those who have waited so long, the greatest gesture is not to rush. He placed the framed phrase on the greenhouse windowsill and asked, almost like a child, where one begins when what one wants is for it to last. Her face wet with soft tears, she replied that you always start at the root. Then, as if signing a pact, she dug her fingers into the soil and loosened the soil around the rosebush a little so the water could seep in. Better. He repeated the gesture at her side, and that small task became a big one without the need for music. Night fell slowly, descending the walls like a curtain that meets the window. In the living room, the table that had once served as a stage for humiliation now held overturned glasses and lined napkins, ready for the next day. In the study, the father's portrait seemed less severe, as if nodding at his late son's choice. In the library, between expensive spines, a worn notebook found a permanent place, not as a display piece but as a reference book. And in the pantry next to the cooling bread there were 2 plates. She passed by, thinking it was someone's oversight, and he, behind her, said no. They were theirs. They sat finally, not as boss and maid, nor as 2 survivors of a scandal, but as 2 people who discovered, each in their own time, that what matters doesn't make noise. They ate simply, spoke little, smiled unhurriedly. Outside, the city went to sleep, unaware. For that in that house that night, destiny had done what it had promised from the beginning, to return everything to its place without destroying those who had to make mistakes to learn. When they said goodbye, there were no guarantees. There was an invitation. Tomorrow morning, he said, I want to learn how to water properly. She laughed briefly, with the freedom of someone no longer afraid of being seen, and replied that the first lesson is to never miss a show, even when it seems nothing has changed. He nodded, and in that nod lay the entire arc of the turnaround. The man who traded loyalty for brilliance now chose constancy, and the woman the world insisted on calling invisible now became the measure of the visible. The mansion took a deep breath, like a house recognizing itself again in a mirror, and if someone from outside asked for a summary, it wouldn't fit in a headline. It would fit in an image. The button that dared to open at the wrong time, the painting with a simple phrase, 2 plates on the table, and a chair that for the first time had the right name.